Now, let us come to the session of health, viewing it both from the sides of patients and companies. It regards us all, and we'll be speaking about innovation, clinical trials, clinical studies, if you like, and data in healthcare. This is the most interesting topic. It regards the whole sector of medicines, of medical equipment. Let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Dimitra Efthimiadou. I'm a journalist, and I will be introducing our speakers. This is a subject we will be all evolving. Next to you, we have Mr. Ioannis Kotsiopoulos, who is the Secretary General of Hospitals, of Health. You are involved with hospitals, so you can speak of all subjects. Mr. Pascal Apostolides is the chairman of AbbVie, one of the biggest pharma companies in Greece, and you want to make clinical studies. Next to him is Mr. Spyros Gkikas, who is President General Manager of GE HealthCare, and at the extreme end, Mr. Nikos Kostaras, who is Managing Director of IQVIA Hellas, the company that collects data from the health sector, and he was also its name day today. Yes, I suppose we've got many Nicholas here today. So let us have a lively chat, because this is what we will be meeting over the next years. And let me start right away. The representative of the Ministry of Health, Mr. Kotsiopoulos, is a person who knows about hospitals, clinical trials, and innovation that has been accompanying us. It's innovation in medicines, in medical equipment, and all that must, in a way, be tied to the data. We've all got half an hour at our disposal. Mr. Kotsiopoulos, let me ask about clinical trials. Why don't we have the appropriate institutional framework in this country so as to facilitate companies to develop clinical trials? Is an integral part that could also bring money to hospital, to the state. The patients will be benefited because they will have access to innovation. I think it seems that something's wrong here. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Ioannis Kotsiopoulos, Secretary General of the Ministry, and under my realm I have the hospitals. Perhaps you have related me with the pandemic. Since the pandemic operated as a catalyst the last 2 years in the Ministry of Health, and is directly linked with clinical trials, since we needed the outcome of innovation so as to have the COVID vaccine. So the pandemic has operated as a catalyst so as to understand that we must do things a little bit different. We must accelerate as a country and European Union at large what we call R&D and clinical trials. Therefore, we need less cost for the health system because patients can be integrated in clinical trials without additional cost. It means a hope for some patients that have gone through all existing therapies, but most clinical trials means greater prestige for our country, but also for the researchers and more money. Yes. There's also the issue of investments, which of course clinical trials means that we can bring in resources from abroad, which will be invested in our hospitals as well. And because you raised the issue of the institutional framework, let me tell you that one of the things that we acknowledge is that the institutional framework doesn't have the necessary incentives, neither for hospitals or the pharma industry. So one of the things that we recently changed this summer is to establish incentives for hospitals. You may perhaps not know it, that the money that was dispersed for clinical trials could not be exploited. That is, the budget of the hospital per se was not increased by those credits. This has changed. So these budget lines can go straight to the hospitals for the purchase of material, biotechnological reagents or whatever. This is already adopted and is enforced. The second thing is that we have had the investment clawback that really gave a push to clinical trials, because let me remind you that investment clawback is more than 500 million euros, including clinical trials. Therefore, incentives were introduced for pharma industry as well. And the third, but equally important, beyond the institutional framework, is the mentality that hospitals should and must develop clinical trials. Of course, this is not something that changes overnight. So we focus on issues of training and additional training of hospital personnel so as to be appropriately equipped to do away with the red tape in the hospitals. And at this point, I must mention that a small team in the Ministry of Health has become an official committee, and all things are discussed there. We have the major workshop next week where all the stakeholders participate. Governors of hospitals, of health regions, from the pharma industry will all be sitting around the table to see how we can move ahead with issues of clinical trials, what we can additionally improve with the institutional framework, what procedures can change, how we can make them simpler. And this is most important, that we also have the participation of the people from hospitals, who are those who really are experts, and we will run those clinical trials, because we've seen an insufficient comprehension of the role by the board of directors of the hospital. So we focus on this osmosis between the state, the pharma industry, and hospital governance, so as to bring in additional ideas, which I hope will allow us to have the next bill on clinical trials before the next elections. I hope that the results of the workshop will conclude into a new institutional framework. But then again, I point out it's not only laws. Laws must also be implemented by certain people. So this is a culture needed, this change management in hospitals, so as to create and form those leaders. So the 40 persons who will be in the Pfizer Center Thessaloniki, I hope that they will be the leaders in this most ambitious venture that will indeed to the increase.
Well, I don't know if you have enough time to make all these things, because the Prime Minister is smelling elections in the air. Now, Mr. Apostolides, what Mr. Kostopoulos said is that there is an intention on behalf of the government. I, as a journalist, will say that all governments had this intention to increase access to innovation in clinical trials. And we only collect 100 million, whereas we could have 500 million? Well, manyfold, I would say. Well, you're the man who knows about innovation. You know the difficulties that are out there. Right, so I will focus exactly on that. It's this slide I have. Now, Mr. Kotsiopoulos, I don't want to flatter him, is probably one of the people who are in the know in the field of health and pharmaceuticals. And he said that the framework that has been created on clinical trials includes, he's talking about the RRF, it includes clinical trials on the one hand, but is not favorable on the other hand. And in 2022, we saw a reduction of clinical trials carried out in our country for no other reason but for lack of this framework supporting these clinical trials. We have many of the best researchers in Europe, many of the best research centers in Europe, not only private ones, but also public hospitals after the intervention that Mr. Kotsiopoulos mentioned, but also recognized from all the references made to our researchers, peer reviews from abroad as regards publications, but also citations foreign fora and conferences. So the infrastructure is there, but we need to go to the status quo ante, institutionally speaking. Incentives in the line presented by Mr. Kotsiopoulos, either in a one-stop shop rationale at hospitals, or with a coordinator, a moderator, that he talked about the incentives of the governors of the hospitals, which are additional resources that are not in our country yet to be able to be utilized and to be used and brought from abroad by us, the pharmaceutical companies. So I understand that you have red tape problems in the hospitals themselves, that the governors of the hospitals impede this. No. They simply don't know it, and it's not in their priorities. This is what Mr. Kotsiopoulos is trying to change. Also, the framework of the RRF does not help now. It's primarily for fixed investments, fixed asset investments, and there's no problem there, but we need fixed asset investments, but we also need investments on clinical trials that are not a once-off, okay? They're not a one-off. Innovative pharmaceutical industry invests 40 billion per year. Now we can have 500 million, which is it's 40 million per year. So 500 million is the EU average. Countries such as Belgium have shown that they can benefit up to 2 billion from clinical trials. And we only 100 million? Yes, indeed, only 100 million. It's a shame. It's a developmental pillar that will be used, but only after the necessary interventions, like Mr. Kotsiopoulos said. Yes, but we need to make haste because the elections are ante portas. Well, the first interventions have already been made, and I am indebted to all the members of the Greek pharmaceutical companies and market that participate, and we have the first legislative interventions first, and we have resolved problems that were festering over time. Now, the goal is to make the framework better, and for lack of time, we'll move on to Mr. Gkikas. GE HealthCare. Mr. Gkikas, you have innovative healthcare equipment, and we have a picture, because we're talking about development and growth, that the hospitals have a rather lengthy and difficult to move in order to adopt this new equipment. So growth is rather limited. And you said earlier, and it's very interesting to share with the rest of the panel, that in order for an equipment to reach the hospital from the moment it's purchased, it's already outdated. It's interesting. Please elaborate.
Thank you for the invitation and for involving me in this nice session. Yes, I represent General Electric, which is one of the biggest companies worldwide in medical equipment, but at the same time I'm here in my capacity as member of the committee of the Hellenic American Chamber on Medical Equipment. And what I will share here express the views of most of the parties involved. There are three major challenges. The first has to do with the clinical trial. How can improve the medical trial, having more cures. The second has to do with the cost. There's a huge cost in the health sector, which continuously soaring, although the fact that 20% of the expenditure could be used in a better way. So it's a small waste. And the third has to do with accessibility. So our innovation can address those challenges in three axes. The first is data. It's not something new, what I'm saying. Each hospital produces 50 megabytes, petabytes of data, which most of it remains unexploited. The second axis are focusing on the patient. That is, we make the innovation patient-centered and give the control and greater participation to the patient in order to secure his health. For instance, today, a pregnant woman can take a ultrasound at home, or can have control in her mammography and make it in an easier way, more comfortable way. The third axis, which is most important, sustainable development. 4.4% of the burdening the climate change is due to health sector. So our industry has a great role to play. And this is through innovative solutions that are guided through those practices. These are the three axes. Patients at the center, data, exploitation that is of the produced data, and sustainable development. I will dwell a little bit on this, on tapping on the data in the next round, because I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Kostaras in this first introduction. You are the company, one of the most known in the country who has most of the data that are being sold. And you're also involved in clinical trials. This was the issue, is always an issue. Why not all companies have access to data so as to direct the markets, the purchases, or development, the basis of specific data? Well, if you allow me, let me make a brief presentation. As a company, we combine both the data and the clinical trials through our latest measure. Since we spoke of figures, the signed contracts, IQVIA, are $26 billion. In Greece, we've only got 80 to 100 million in Greece. There are also other big companies with remarkable clinical trials. That means there's a great chapter, a huge fund invested in clinical trials. You must view Greece as a country fighting for a small market share. So if we change and improve the institutional framework, if we change management, that Mr. Kotsiopoulos has said, the notions and perceptions of the administration in hospitals, then we'll be able to attract more money without the state having to disperse anything more. This will not be a cost for the state. It will be investments, because each investment in a clinical trial, and we'll see it in the first slide you'd see, is 22 million euros is the positive impact on the GDP growth for each 10 million euros invested. So the 100 million euros invested currently bring along 220 because of the taxes paid, the clinical tests, the labs, and so forth. Imagine if we attracted 500 million, as is the average in the European Union. The impact would be 1.1 billion euros. If you read the latest news on the direct foreign investment in Greece, they reached 4.4 billion euros in the first semester. So this 500 million we're discussing, it's a huge figure. Imagine what would have happened. So that money will be infused in the company, in salaries, social contribution. The state will collect, there will be diverted consumption. So it's a win-win-win situation. Everybody wins. So this with regard to the financial aspect, new jobs and so forth. Now, it has been said before, we touched upon the issue of the clawback and the innovative medicines. There's always a problem, ever exacerbated in Greece, and we should not turn a blind eye to that, having to do with the cost of new therapies. Innovative therapies are far more costly than the existing ones. And of course, when we speak of rare diseases, they're even more costly. There is such a rare disease that entails more than 2 million euros for the treatment. So innovation must be created. So we must create a fund for innovation. We can't ask the state to create that. So we might have an innovation fund financed by the increase of revenues of pharma industry through clinical trials. So if we have great investment in clinical trials, the state, by acknowledging the positive impact, might divert part of those profits in funding the innovation fund. That would be to the benefit of pharma industries and those that have innovative drugs, and those who do not have the innovative drugs, that they will have less impact on clawback, and the patient for and foremost. And we will have greater visibility vis-à-vis the cost of the next years. So, in a simple scheme, at the left we would see the pharma industry putting greater investment in clinical trials, the state that we will be funding through an existing mechanism, theoretically speaking, will be funding the innovation fund, and the benefits will be for the patient, the state, and the pharma industry, both Greek and foreign ones. So, as I said, it is a plan, it is a proposal that entails only benefits for everyone, and it is worth discussing. Let us view the pros and cons and see how we can improve it. So that was our proposal.
Right. This is something that you want an innovation fund to be created in which the companies will invest. The state will stand to win. Mr. Kotsiopoulos, and please explain that, because correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Apostolides has mentioned this innovation fund for a great number of years. Am I wrong? No, you're not, madam. Right, so the state will stand to win, the companies will stand to win, but the one who invests will be the one to gain the most, because some of the money will be returned to them by the state. I don't know how this can happen. I imagine that will be a combination of taxation reduction, clawback reduction, or whatnot. Now, this is a proposal that I personally have heard in the past quite a lot. Mr. Kostaras visualized it very, very well, how it can happen. Why is it that no government has adopted it? I think it's to the benefit of everyone. First of all, as we said, our government is very open to the co-drafting of proposals alongside the markets. We're very open to looking at the details of this proposal, to examine them. It would be very good if we could have this institutionally in the framework of the committee we have at the Ministry of Health, so as to allow everyone who cover the entire spectrum of stakeholders to speak their minds. But it's definitely something that does hold water and will allow for some discussion. But what was very well described by Mr. Kostaras is that what we need is more clinical data, and IQVIA has a particular specialization in this field. Now, if you'd like, the part of clinical trials, one of the reasons why clinical trials have not taken off as much as they have and have not bloomed in the clinical area of our country is that there is a very low level of digitalization in the hospital. So when we have very few clinical data, it's very difficult to do patient recruitment, come up with patients. So what we invest in through the RRF is the digitalization of hospitals, with particular emphasis on the clinical subsystems, which is what is of interest. Clinical data, not financial data, that more or less, and after 10 years of financial crisis, we do have available. So what we need to see is how we can make the hospitals paperless or paper rights and paper light, and base themselves on new technologies to have more clinical data on the course of the patients in the hospital itself. So this digitalization in and of itself, and utilizing Mr. Kostaras as well, the data at the secondary level, which is the European EU health data space, which will be passed by the European Parliament in early 2023, this is how we make the difference. All these efforts now through the RRF, the EU data space, I believe, will shape an entirely different framework for clinical trials in our country, which appears to have a very active role. In the EU regulation, we are partners and we send our comments. In the RRF, we are one of the countries that spends and invests more money in the digitalization of health, digital health, if you'd like. So we position ourselves quite differently, and this is something we will see slowly have an impact on clinical trials. Right, well, you mentioned data, Mr. Kotsiopoulos. I will ask Mr. Apostolides to have one last round of questions. You, because you were the president of the sphere, you have asked for these data for quite some time that come from e-prescription. Why do they hide it? It will be anonymized. Why don't they give the companies these data so that they can, direct their investment, the innovative treatments and technological and medical devices and everything? Have you realized, have you understood why they hide it? It's sort of state secret. I mean, I'm sure you don't need the names, the first and last name of the patients, but do you have an answer for this? Well, I'm still here, you know. Yes, I do want a final answer from the SG, but I want Mr. Apostolides to answer. Well, a large tanker is not easy to steer. It will not turn on its head, you know, okay? It will not turn on a dime. We have a rationale on behalf of the state that has been the same for decades, but this is a mentality that changes. We have EU legislation. We have implementation of this legislation within the EU, so we have good examples to follow of implementation. I'm talking about Finland. They have utilized such data. And they have been heard, and they have created their insurance fund from the 900 requests that have been made over the past 3 years, and this is yesterday's questions. 700 of them have been answered. Resources for the AOP the utilization of these data is most valuable to us. Mrs. Efthimiadou said that we've had these data for 10 years. Now we pay them in gold. It's like the treasure of Atreus. One of our companies paid here in the country 8.1 billion for this data. And why is it valuable? Because we can design new drugs, new molecules by watching what is the response of the population. Of course, fully anonymized, or on populations that have comorbidities, so that this design will bring about new drugs faster. You saw what happened with the coronavirus. Mr. Kotsiopoulos mentioned it. There were vaccines that emerged in less than a year, targeted treatments in less than 2 years. Imagine innovative drugs instead of 10 years to emerge in 2 or 3 years. And we pay gold, they're weighting gold for this data, and they're sitting around, and we'll have new funds for the Ministry of Health and Ministry. The SG says that we're not in cahoots with Mr. Apostolides, but he covered what I said. Now, this thing with the EU regulation will resolve issues, because this is not something that is dealt only by our country. There are many countries in the EU. Hence, the discussion at the European level with the European regulation. Given that the implementation of the GDPR in each member state was different and created these problems that we have until today. So it's very frustrating. I agree the criticism. I accept the criticism that says the way in which the GDPR is implemented in our country is rather a deterrent. Right, Mr. Gkikas, to look at the medical device products that can utilize this data. Isn't this true, Mr. Gkikas? All the more so?
Well, we have the reverse problem. We find data. It's a shame that we can't find them in Greece, but we don't have the digital systems, but we can find them abroad. But our agents use thousands of data and create smart algorithms of AI or artificial learning. The point is that private hospitals and public hospitals to have the budget to ask data and have it fed in the system. So haven't reached that point, because the procedures are so slow that until such a process is completed, an innovation becomes obsolete and is lost. In the private sector, on the other hand, we recently saw a very daring reform that had been expecting for years, the introduction of qualitative data with regard to the reimbursement of clinical acts, which was tremendous. But in order for that to integrate innovation, which uses data, must become more daring, so as to offer incentives to private sector to have those applications introduced. And then that will be a virtuous circle. Data will support the production and collection of qualitative data, and that will be used for innovation. Mr. Kostaras, a comment on that, so as to conclude with Mr. Kotsiopoulos. You are the person who are swimming in data, and you know how this can direct the development of companies or even technological products, Mr. Kostaras. Well, we have no time, so let me say that we have both the know-how. Let me remind you that we have a hub for business intelligence, which is of worldly renown, with 35 staffed with 35 scientists that take projects for more than 60 countries, and another hub for HTA with 23 persons of an European level, and they work of world-class data. Imagine if we had the Greek data. There are countries such as Israel, far more advanced than us. And I give it as an example because we recently bought out such a company with data. Imagine if we had it in Greece. It would be a huge financial benefit for the state, but most importantly, it would be a benefit for the patient. Quicker, swifter clinical trials, quicker and better outcomes. We can be really pioneers. Samely as we make the hubs, Greece must be put on the map and state that we are a country that we can create the know-how and export it. We have this capacity. We just need the hurdles to be done away. We're all here to help. It's not a criticism here. We're here to help so as to have things run smoothly. We can make Greece far stronger. And data is something that will bring in positive results, both in economy and health. Well, so this menacing message with the time. Okay, I've exceeded. We close with Mr. Kotsiopoulos because he represents the government. So let us keep his commitment that you will be facilitating through a new institutional framework clinical trials. You will also be facilitating the dissemination of data so as for companies to move ahead for growth, and you contribute. Well, we said a lot of will, and I don't like all that. Contrary to the past, let me say that clinical trials have been and always are a strategic choice, and many things have already been done. We are on the same page at last with all the stakeholders. There is money from the RRF, and we made a huge effort to earmark those funds for digital transformation of health and new machines and equipment, because there will be generous infusion for medical equipment renovation in hospitals. So there is a strategy. We're in line with the market. There is money available for them, the RRF, and the effort is made to put it in the right direction, and all that along the European regulation, which is to be adopted at the beginning of 2023, will set a new course for clinical trials. And this will not be wishful thinking. So this is a commitment. Yes, it's not we will, it's a commitment. Finished. So let me thank you all, and each one separately, for the nice live discussion, and thank you all who had the patience to follow these very important subjects on health that regard us all.